So today's submitted material explores the critical distinction between purely digital and genuinely machine-readable financial data,
Mm-hmm.
basically arguing that designing systems for true machine readability is this urgent, strategic requirement driven by, global government compliance and the demands of enterprise AI.
Right.
And the author clearly possesses deep expertise in enterprise data architecture. I mean, this piece makes a phenomenal case for treating data structure as a strategic position. So let's just dive right into how we can elevate this incredibly strong foundation, focusing first on that transition from conceptual architecture to operational reality.
I'm definitely ready. The baseline knowledge here is exceptional, honestly. It sets a perfect runway for us to push the boundaries of how this argument lands with its intended executive audience.
Yeah, exactly. So we begin with the core framework. The text brilliantly defines the three layers of machine readability.
Right, the structural, semantic, and contextual.
Yes, structural predictability, so, using standards like UNCEFACT and PEPL, then semantic consistency, which relies on canonical data models, and finally, contextual completeness.
Mm-hmm.
But, as I read through the author's critique of bespoke integration code and this whole map once, use everywhere principle, I kept thinking about the messy reality of enterprise systems.
Oh, the reality is incredibly messy.
Right? I mean, the current state of enterprise transformations is basically it's like untangling a decades-old ball of yarn versus simply buying a new spool.
That's a great way to put it.
And the new spool is obviously better, but I found myself questioning if the text makes the actual unspooling process clear enough for a CIO who's staring at that giant mess of yarn right now.
The manuscript establishes a powerful conceptual framework for machine readability, but the operational realities of migrating legacy enterprise systems remain slightly abstract for an executive audience.
Yeah, abstract is the right word. Because, the text meticulously explains why those bespoke transformations fail as you scale up, right?
The n-squared complexity issue?
Exactly. If you have 50 systems, you don't have 50 connections. You have over 1,000. And it clearly explains what canonical data models achieve. But I feel like it assumes the reader can just inherently visualize the operational friction of moving to this canonical ideal.
That is exactly the weakness here. The text explains the why and the what, but by focusing purely on the pristine architectural end state, the material misses an opportunity to acknowledge and address the immediate implementation anxieties of technology leaders.
Right, because the CIO is already stressed out.
Oh, completely. A CIO reading this already knows their data architecture is a fragile web of localized truths. When they read about achieving semantic consistency, their brain skips the theory and goes straight to the pain of implementation.
Like, how do I untangle this without breaking my daily operations?
Exactly. So if we only show them the finish line, we risk alienating them. We haven't acknowledged the operational mud they have to wade through first.
So what's the fix? Because we obviously don't want the author to drag the narrative into like a swamp of technical integration tutorials, right? It still needs to be a strategic document.
Right, so the suggestion is to introduce a high-stakes comparative scenario that grounds the abstract architectural theory in a tangible, everyday operational workflow.
Okay, give me an example of what that looks like.
You want to show a specific before and after scenario. For instance, describe a multinational organization processing a complex invoice where, say, a critical tax code is missing.
Oh, I like that. So in the legacy approach, that broken invoice comes in.
And because there is no universal semantic layer, it gets routed to an analytic system and a compliance platform, and each one applies different bespoke transformations to guess that missing data.
Right. The analytics system assumes one tax rate, the compliance platform assumes another, and suddenly you have completely divergent reports.
Exactly. Now you have a massive compliance risk.
So then the author contrasts that with the new ideal state.
Yes, in the ideal state, utilizing the canonical data model, the system flags its semantic inconsistency instantly at the API gateway. It demonstrates the map once, use everywhere principle in action.
Wow, yeah, that proves to the CIO exactly how the new architecture prevents a compliance failure in real time. That takes it from an abstract theory to a measurable operational victory.
It really does. It grounds the entire concept.
Okay, so that perfectly anchors the architecture, but if we trace that missing tax code backwards, like if the system catches it at the gateway, it means somebody failed to input it correctly in the first place, right?
Which brings us to the point of data creation.
Yes, and this section of the text really made me pause. The author insists that completeness must be enforced at the source, the ERP.
Validation at source.
Right. The argument is that business rules have to be enforced when a transaction is literally being created. To use an analogy, it's like putting the bouncer at the front door of the club rather than checking IDs at the bar.
That makes perfect architectural sense.
It does. If the data isn't contextually complete at birth, it shouldn't be allowed into the system. But I have to push back a little here. Does shifting all this validation upstream risk grinding daily business operations to a dead halt? Human operators are out there trying to move fast.
While the architectural argument for upstream validation is incredibly robust, the organizational and cultural shifts required to implement these rigid source system constraints are completely overlooked.
Yeah, because we're talking about humans, not machines.
Exactly. The weakness here is that the material treats validation at source purely as a technical configuration of the ERP, bypassing the reality that human employees usually generate this data.
And human beings are incentivized by speed, not data governance.
Right. By ignoring the user experience, the argument fails to address the very real operational bottleneck that occurs when strict downstream compliance rules are suddenly forced onto upstream procurement or sales teams.
I've actually seen this happen. A team will be so used to bypassing fields just to get transactions done, they'll literally just put a period in a required text box to close a deal before the end of the quarter.
I've seen that too, and if you suddenly turn on hard stops in the ERP without addressing user behavior, your architecture functions flawlessly, it successfully blocks bad data, but your business stops generating revenue.
The sales rep literally cannot hit submit. And to a CEO, an architecture that halts revenue is a failed architecture.
Precisely. So the suggestion is to expand the validation at source argument to briefly acknowledge the critical relationship between architectural enforcement and user behavior.
So how do they do that without turning this into a human resources change management manual?
Keep it anchored to the technology. As a concrete example, mention the temporary friction that occurs when an ERP system is suddenly configured to block an invoice creation because a business partner's VAT number is missing.
Okay, so the system throws a hard stop.
Yes, acknowledge that while the architectural standard demands this hard stop, organizations must pair this machine-readable by design mandate with improved user interfaces or proactive data entry training.
Ah, I see. So the UI needs to actually explain why the VAT number is required now instead of just throwing some generic error 400 code.
Exactly. Validating at the source is as much a change management challenge as an architectural one. Acknowledging that tells the executive, I know what happens when you flip this switch, and here is how you prevent a revolt on the sales floor.
That bridges the gap perfectly. Okay, so now that we've addressed the practical implementation and the human element at the source, let's scale back out to the macro-level drivers.
The big external forces.
Right. The author identifies two massive ones. First, you have the immediate threat of continuous transaction controls, or CTCs, where government tax authorities demand real-time clearance. And second, the ultimate promise of machine-readable data acting as AI infrastructure.
Both very compelling points.
They are, but reading it, I noticed they are presented as two somewhat distinct sections. It almost reset the momentum for me. Could grouping them too closely dilute the immediate terror of the compliance mandate, or is there a way to make them feed into each other?
The dual driving forces of regulatory mandates and AI readiness are both highly compelling, yet their current structural placement causes them to compete for the reader's attention rather than compounding into a unified climax.
It's like two parallel arguments right now.
That is the weakness. The narrative establishes the existential threat of continuous transaction controls early on, explaining how millisecond-level clearance breaks legacy systems.
Right, you're terrified of the government audits.
But then, pages later, it pivots to the future-proofing promise of enterprise AI. Because these concepts are structurally separated, the reader is asked to care about compliance and then separately asked to care about AI.
Missing the incredibly powerful causal link between the two.
Completely missing it. The data you feed the tax authority is the exact same structured payload you need to feed the LLM context window to prevent hallucinations.
Ah, a canonical data model doesn't care who the consumer is.
Exactly. So the suggestion here is to restructure the progression of the argument to frame the regulatory mandate as the immediate catalyst that forces the architectural rebuild, which then organically unlocks the foundational infrastructure for reliable AI.
Harmonizing the stick and the carrot.
Yes, the government mandate is the stick. It secures the budget and forces the redesign because business continuity is legally on the line.
The board will approve the $100 million data rebuild if they are legally barred from trading in Europe otherwise.
Exactly. And once you do that painful work, you possess the exact pristine dataset required to deploy AI effectively. That is the carrot.
So how explicitly should the author link these in the text? Give me a concrete example.
Use explicit transition language. For instance, you could state, the strict millisecond-level mandates of continuous transaction controls are forcing organizations to build the exact same canonical data models that enterprise AI requires to function.
Oh, that is a fantastic line.
Frame compliance as the stick, and AI as the ultimate strategic multiplier that is unlocked precisely because the organization was forced to comply with government standards.
That transforms the manuscript from just an informative white paper into an urgent strategic roadmap. You solve the compliance nightmare, and you get AI readiness basically for free.
It creates a single, compounded narrative climax. A CFO simply cannot ignore that logic.
Absolutely not. Well, this has been a truly fantastic exploration of a highly sophisticated piece of writing. Let's just briefly recap the core findings of our critique today.
Sounds good.
So, the submitted material is already highly persuasive and correctly identifies a massive blind spot in modern data architecture. But to elevate it from great to undeniable, the author should focus on three things. First, anchor the architectural theory with a tangible before and after operational scenario.
Show us that missing tax code and how the canonical data model fixes it.
Exactly. Second, address the human change management aspect of moving data validation to the source. Acknowledge the friction of hard stops and the need for better UI.
Don't ignore the sales team revolt.
Right. And third, structurally link the immediate threat of continuous transaction controls with the future payoff of AI infrastructure to create a single, compounded narrative climax.
The stick and the carrot.
You got it. We really want to thank the listener for submitting such thought-provoking work. It's always a privilege to read material of this caliber.
It really is.
We enthusiastically invite you to apply these structural adjustments and submit your revised piece back in for a future critique. We'd love to see how this narrative evolves.